Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, so I've met a few of you in the last couple of days, but for those that haven't met me, my name's Mark Lassau. I work in JIRA development in what we call the engine room team. I think the name's fairly self-explanatory. We do the core server-side, I guess, JIRA engine. For you guys, what that probably means, and is most importantly, we're the ones who maintain the service API, that is the Java API, and we're building out the JIRA REST API, which you'll hear all about in the next talk given by Rich Manelang. But I'm not here to talk about JIRA today, or I'm not here to talk about JIRA specifically. I'm going to talk about application links, which is a technology that works not just in JIRA, but in all the Atlassian applications. So it'll work in Confluence, Bamboo, Fisheye. What I want to show you is how you can write a plugin that can talk to an external application and get authenticated talking to that external application. We're going to have a little look, just enough, on OAuth and what specifically you'll need to do if you want to use OAuth. OAuth's pretty important. It turns out application links makes it easy for you to use, so don't be scared of OAuth. Now, those two things, if you're just writing integration between one Atlassian application and another Atlassian application, that's going to be all you'll need to know. But if you want to get tricky and talk to a third-party application, we're going to learn a little bit more about how you can write a custom application type, and if you have to, because your application has some crazy authentication scheme that isn't supported out of the box, how you can write a custom authentication scheme. Once again, sounds scary, but it's not really as hard as you may think, because AppLinks provides a lot of the heavy lifting for you. So first of all, just to get us started, let's have a quick look at what AppLinks is, just for any of you that aren't aware. It's known by a few different names. We usually call it AppLinks for short. It's also known as APL. Anyway, that's its key in its JIRA instance. It's also called Unified AppLinks, or UAL. So they all mean the same thing. So if you hear those, don't get confused. Now, AppLinks by itself, it doesn't actually do anything. It's just there to enable you as a plugin developer to write cool integrations. So what does it give us? The first thing that you get is a common configuration UI. The best news there is you don't have to go and write the configuration UI yourself. You can get on with doing the job of making features that are actually usable to the user. Now, as a side effect of that, we get a couple of other advantages. First of all the configurations in one place. The admin has a consistent look and feel, and it all looks the same whenever they're setting up any configuration. And often they can configure a application link one time, and it may be shared by multiple plugins. If there's a few different plugins that are all interested in talking from JIRA to Confluence, the admin only sets up that configuration one time. The other thing that we get is some out-of-the-box authentication providers. So JIRA and the other Atlassian applications give you OAuth, they give you basic auth, and they give you trusted apps. We'll learn a little bit more about what they are and the differences between them later on. The whole application links library is quite modular and extendable. It's quite easy to extend, and we'll see that near the end. But the most important thing that you get is you get factories. You get a helper method that will help you make an authenticated HTTP request to that external server, taking away a lot of the hard work of even knowing what the authentication configuration is and how to do it. Okay, we're all developers. Let's get straight into the code. So this is how you make an authenticated request to an external server. The first thing you do is you get hold of the application link service. That's just a service that you can get injected into your plugin via dependency injection. With that application link service, you get hold of the application link that you're interested in. Just to keep the example simple, I've said get me the primary JIRA application link. But you could know a specific application that you want to talk to. You could be looping over all the Confluence links and dealing with each one, or whatever. Once you have an application link, you can use it to create an authenticated request factory. Okay, so this guy is going to be able to create requests for us, and it puts all the authentication in there for us. We see here, using the authenticated request factory, all we need to do is pass in the HTTP method, get, put, post, and a relative URL. The application link and the request factory itself knows the base URL, and you just put in the end path. Once we've got that request, we can execute the request. I'm using the simplest execute method there. There's a few other ways to do it where you can do better error handling and what have you. I'm just calling this the simple execute method. It returns a string, which is the response. In our particular case there, it's probably a JSON blob. We parse that and we grab the data out that we want. Okay? It's as easy as that, almost. The one small gotcha, I don't know how well you can see it on the screen there, it washes stuff out a bit. That request factory, the request method, can actually throw a credentials required exception. Okay, so if for some reason it's not ready to be able to make an authenticated request yet, it will throw this exception, and you will have to do a little bit of work to help that happen. So this is really all about OAuth. It won't happen for the other authentication types out of the box. So let's have a quick look at those authentication types and what they actually mean. Okay, authentication in app links. The admin, when they set up a link, they get to choose 0 or more authentication types. You'd normally set up one, obviously, but there can be times you'd maybe set up more than one. So we have basic auth, trusted apps, and OAuth out of the box. Basic auth you probably all know already. It sends a weakly encoded username and password with every HTTP request. The way that basic auth works in application links is you configure a single username and password. That single username and password will be used by every user in the local system. Will all be using those same credentials when they go to the remote system. So that often would be a disadvantage. You often want to have separate credentials for each of your users, although there are possibly times where you really only do have one account on the remote system, and so everyone has to share one anyway. Basic auth, it's pretty simple to configure. You probably don't want everyone to have the same credentials, and taking a password and storing someone else's password in our application, a little bit naff. Next we have trusted apps. Trusted apps is an Atlassian proprietary protocol, so unfortunately it's really only going to work if you're trying to connect two Atlassian applications together. It provides what Application Links calls impersonating authentication. So that's what when a user on the first system maps to a user on the second system, as opposed to basic auth, which was non-impersonating, as we just saw. And the way Trusted Apps maps those users, well, it assumes that you have exactly the same user base on both sides. So it assumes if there's a username called Fred in the first system, it assumes that that's owned by the same user who has the Fred username on the second system. So the good side of that is, well, it respects the separate user privileges. It doesn't require us to store a password there, and there's no special work needed by the plugin or further work needed by the users. We'll see in OAuth what they need to do that makes that a little different. Of course, it only really works if you're connecting to another Atlassian application, and you must have shared user bases. So you either need a small user base that you are manually making sure they're exactly the same users, or if both applications are connected to a single crowd server, a single LDAP server, well, in that case you can use it, but obviously there's lots of times when that will be inappropriate. Which brings us on to OAuth. OAuth is a standards-based protocol. It's actually implemented by quite a few different third-party applications, so it is usable in a lot of different places. And it allows the user to actually explicitly grant access or not grant access to the first application to be able to get its resources on the second application. So, like I mentioned, it's already implemented in lots of different third-party systems, so you can often just use it. It doesn't store passwords like we saw before with basic auth. It doesn't assume that your user bases are exactly the same, so that makes it very useful. And you can actually grant and revoke access to the resources, so you do have a lot more control. And the only real disadvantages are you need to do a little bit more work as a plugin, and the user will have to jump out and go and authorize and say this is all okay and then come back. So it's maybe not quite as smooth a user experience. Okay, so let's just see a little bit more about OAuth and how it works. So obviously there's the three players there. In the OAuth love triangle, we have the user, we have the client, and I've included there, you can see both the front end and the back end together. So the browser and the Atlassian application, and obviously your plugin as well, they're all acting as this part of the same party. And then there's the remote service provider that we want to access and get some resources off. So this is what it looks like to the user. So imagine we added some special functionality to the JIRA comments where you could actually type in a remote issue key and it knew how to go to that remote JIRA server and give you some more information. When the user first comes here, we don't yet have access. We don't yet have the rights to go and talk to the remote, the second JIRA server. So the best thing that we can do is just put a little link on the screen that the user can click. When they click it, they actually get redirected away from this first JIRA server and they go to the second JIRA server. If they're not logged in, they'll need to log in. Once they're logged in, they get this screen here and they'll choose to approve access or deny access to let the first server get to resources in the second server on their behalf. And then once that happens, that second server needs to know how to redirect you back to where you came from in the first place so it can actually show you something useful. So have a little pop-up there where it can show you the summary of the issue, for example. Okay, so let's see how, well, this is actually, don't read this slide. This is what's all happening in the background. This is what you don't need to know. This is what AppLinks is taking care of for you. If you're really interested, you need to know all the details because you're that sort of person. There's a link right at the end on my last slide where you'll be able to go and read up more about OAuth. Okay, getting back to writing that plugin where we were hanging with the credentials required exception. So let's imagine that code that we saw before where we were making that JSON request and parsing the data. We put all that into a little remote issue manager just to make it a bit better designed. Now, the happy path is this thing actually returns and gives us some data for that remote issue, and we can build up whatever we want to build up. A little bit of HTML I've got here that shows the issue summary as a pop-up. However, of course, our method can throw credentials required exception, and we need to somehow start the OAuth dance. Well, it's a lot easier than you might think. The first thing we need to do, we need to build a callback URL. This is the URL that we want the remote server to eventually send the user back to. So we build that up. And then what we do, the exception itself has a method, a handy little method here, the getAuthorization URI, that will give us the URL for the remote server. All we need to give it is the callback URL. So it's pretty easy. All we need to do is get hold of that URL and the redirect URL and then put something on the screen so the user can click on it and they'll go and do the dance. Okay, so really that's all you need to do if you want to connect two Atlassian applications together. You can see we've done a lot of the heavy lifting, we've done all the configuration, we've made it as easy as it possibly can be. But what if you need to get a little bit fancier? Now, AppLinks, out of the box, it does have a special generic application type that the admin can configure, and it will let you set up either OAuth or basic auth. But it could be that you just want to make it a bit easier for them. You may know that your remote server handles OAuth but not basic auth, or vice versa. Or it could even be they have some custom authentication provider. So let's see what we can do to give them a slightly better screen so it'll look like this, and we'll have our own custom authentication type. So in this case, I've got a full application type. So one of the reasons we may do it, and that's just a little screenshot there, is because we may need to have our own authentication provider. So you can see there I've got some naff little secret token. And the other thing that you get is when when they've got it all configured, it actually has their application name and a pretty little icon. Yay, we've got our own icon rather than just something blank and generic. So of course this is a plugin module that you'll need to implement, and there's actually two different classes we need to implement to have a custom application type. The first one is the application type, and the next one is called a manifest producer. So let's see how they work. The application type, pretty simple. You basically have a unique ID to identify your application type. You can put in an I18N key so you can have a nice name for it, and of course the icon URL so we can have our own icon. Then we have the manifest producer. If you look at the second method, the first thing the manifest producer gives us is a way we can do a little heartbeat ping. So this is a way we can help app links know if the remote server is up or down. It's optional. You can return available all the time if you want to not bother checking, but it is kind of nice if you can find that out and let the user know. And apart from that, obviously, well, it's a manifest producer, so it produces a manifest. The manifest has a few methods, but they're mostly pretty well boilerplate. It has a type ID just to tie it back to the application type that we set up before. It needs an application ID for the specific application that we're linking to of that type, but we have helper methods to help you generate that, and then it has a name of the type. More importantly, it has these two methods to name the authentication types. So we can name which inbound authentication types it supports and which outbound authentication types it supports. Just watch these methods. Read the Java doc when you come to implement these, because the naming here is actually the reverse of what you might expect. They're talking about inbound from the point of view of the remote server, but once you've read it, it's all pretty obvious. And then it has a whole bunch of other boilerplate methods. Pretty simple. You can return null in most of these except for the bug. So just as a little trap, watch out for this. The Java doc says you can return null on this method, but if you do, you won't be able to delete that link. It throws a null pointer exception. Okay, so that really wasn't too difficult. That was setting up a custom application type. We can also set up a custom authentication provider. So the interface that we have to implement here is the Authentication Provider plugin module. It's a bit of a funny name, but the actual design and shape of the API does make sense, and it's quite good. So the first thing that you may need to do for your Authentication Provider plugin module is tell it how to do its configuration, because the configuration is going to be completely custom. So you name a URL, and then it will go to that URL and put your page, nest your page inside the main configuration page in an iframe. And then you can put whatever you want in your configuration. The normal way that you'd do this, of course, is you'd probably implement a custom servlet. I'm not going to show you how to do a servlet today, but the important thing to know is that once you're done getting the configuration details off the user, the thing that you need to do is store those details somewhere, obviously. So there's actually a manager here, once again, get it dependency injected, which allows you to store and retrieve your data, and it takes an arbitrary map of key value pairs. So now that we have a way of getting the configuration UI, we also need to get the authentication provider itself. So you implement this get authentication provider method. It takes a link. I've got a quick test there to see, am I actually configured to use this authentication type first? And then if I am, I return my authentication provider. And what you may notice here is I've also injected into that authentication provider a SAL request factory. We'll see why in a sec. And that's because the authentication provider, he needs to return an authenticated request factory. So the easiest way to do this is to basically wrap the SAL request factory. SAL request factory, once again, you can get it dependency injected into yourself. It's able to make non-authenticated requests, and then you can use those to authenticate them. One other thing to note here, you can see the username method that's being taken in the get request factory. That's because I've declared further up that this is a impersonating authentication provider. If you wanted to implement a non-impersonating one, you wouldn't have the username in the method because you wouldn't need it. Okay, so obviously a request factory needs to at some stage be able to create requests, and like I said, all we're doing here, you don't have to do it this way, you could implement it yourself, but I think this is the easiest way. You create a non-authenticated request with the SAL request factory, and then you add your authentication data to that. So you may be adding some headers like I've done there. You may be playing around with the URL, I guess, adding a param or something like that. And you need to return an application link request. He looks a lot like the SAL request. You'll just want to wrap the SAL request inside the wrapped request and just use a delegating pattern and pass most of the method calls, just pass those method calls straight on to the wrapped request. So we can see there we have been able to create an authenticated request factory. So if we cast our mind back to the earlier slides where we saw how to actually consume app links, well, that's obviously how app links is getting hold of the authenticated request factory for us to use. So there you have it. We've seen using app links, we can very easily talk to an external server, and we get a lot of features already built in for us, like the UI. It makes it very easy to make an authenticated request. Even if the machine at the other end is using OAuth, we provide as much as we can to help you out. You just need to make some little links to set off the OAuth dance. If you need to connect to a third-party app, you can make that quite pretty and polished and professional by creating your own custom application type. And if you really have to create your own authentication scheme, well, you can. It's all there. We do as much as we can. Of course, we can't do everything, but we make it as easy as possible. Thank you very much.